The soft morning light filtered through the windows of Teresa and Daniel's small kitchen, creating a warm and inviting atmosphere filled with anticipation. The table, covered in papers and documents, reflected the couple's excitement. With a smile on her face, Teresa organized the papers while Daniel flipped through a catalog of baby furniture. The idea of having a child, now accompanied by the news of her pregnancy, filled the space with joy. "Look at this crib, love. Isn't it adorable? We can put it in the nursery that we still need to decorate," Daniel said, pointing to a colorful image on the page. His voice overflowed with enthusiasm, and Teresa couldn't help but smile at his excitement. "Yes, and we need to think of a name. How about Miguel for a boy?" Teresa suggested, sitting down at the table and looking over the financial documents with hopeful eyes. "Miguel is a strong name, and if it's girls, what do you think of Clara and Sophia?" Daniel replied, daydreaming about the possibilities that lay ahead. "I believe we can handle whatever comes our way, as long as we're together." "That's true. Together, we are stronger. We can overcome any challenge life throws at us," Teresa said, holding Daniel's hand firmly. The couple exchanged glances that spoke more than words, a deep connection that united them in their hopes and dreams. Time flew by, and weeks later, Teresa found herself nervously sitting in a doctor's office while the physician prepared for the ultrasound. Daniel was by her side, holding her hand tightly, a gesture that conveyed support and love. "Are you ready to see what's happening in there?" the doctor asked with a smile as he turned on the machine. Teresa's heart raced, engulfed in a mix of anxiety and joy. "Yes, we're ready," Daniel responded, his voice full of anticipation. As the images began to appear on the screen, the room filled with a reverent silence. The doctor examined the images, and a smile formed on his face. "Congratulations, you're having triplets." The words echoed in the room, and a nervous laugh escaped Teresa as tears of joy began to well in her eyes. "Triplets? That's amazing." Daniel couldn't contain his emotion. "We're going to have 3 children at once. This is incredible," he exclaimed, pulling Teresa into a tight embrace. However, despite the happiness, concern began to creep into their hearts. "How are we going to take care of 3 babies?" Teresa whispered, looking at Daniel with a serious expression. "We'll find a way, my love. We always do," Daniel replied, stroking her face. "We have each other, and that's all we need." As the pregnancy progressed, sleepless nights became common. One day, after a routine checkup, Daniel and Teresa were in the waiting room of the doctor's office, anxious for another update about the babies. The doctor entered with a serious expression, immediately putting the couple on high alert. "Teresa, we need to talk," he said, looking directly at her. "The tests show that you're pregnant with 7 children." Teresa's world collapsed in an instant. 7 children? Daniel looked at Teresa, his eyes widening in surprise. In a sudden movement, he fainted, the chair creaking as his body slumped. Teresa, in shock, tried to process the magnitude of the situation. 7? It can't be, she murmured, tears streaming down her face as she held Daniel's hand, trying to bring him back to reality. The doctor rushed to help him recover, but Teresa's mind was flooded with thoughts. 7 children. It was both a dream and a nightmare at the same time. How would they manage? Financial worries began to pile up, and happiness mingled with fear. Teresa looked at her husband, who was beginning to regain consciousness, and despite the panic, a spark of hope still burned in her heart. They were a team, and together they would face whatever lay ahead. The soft morning light filtered through the hospital window, illuminating the room where Teresa was hospitalized. The high-risk pregnancy had led her to this place, far from her home and her children, who were only young ones these days. With each passing day, she felt the weight of responsibility on her shoulders, knowing that their lives depended on her, but also on Daniel's strength, who was outside, working tirelessly at the family market. Teresa gazed at the white walls and wondered what life would be like when it was all over. "Teresa, are you feeling okay?" The nurse entered with a warm smile, but Teresa could see the concern etched on her face. "I am, just a little tired. And my kids?" Teresa asked, worried about their absence. She knew Daniel was doing his best, but she missed her united family. "They're doing well. Your husband is doing a great job taking care of them," the nurse replied, trying to reassure her. "But you need to rest. The health of the babies is the priority right now." As the nurse left, Teresa lost herself in thoughts about the life she was building. The idea of being the mother of 7 children was a blessing, but also a monumental challenge. She remembered Daniel, always optimistic, believing that together they could weather any storm. But the storm that was approaching was darker than anyone could imagine. A few months later, Daniel's little grocery store was invaded on a fateful night. An attempted robbery ended in tragedy. Teresa was at home, surrounded by her children, when she received the call that would change her life forever. The sound of the police officer's voice on the other end of the line was like a blow to the chest. "I'm so sorry, ma'am. Your husband, he didn't survive." The pain was indescribable. The words echoed in her mind as she tried to comprehend what had happened. "No, it can't be true," Teresa screamed, her hands trembling as she leaned against the wall, tears streaming down her face. The children, frightened, rushed to her side. "What happened, Mommy?" one of the twins asked, her confused expression tightening Teresa's heart even more. He's in a better place now," Teresa murmured, trying to find the strength to comfort her children. But the truth was that in that moment, she couldn't even comfort herself. Daniel's funeral took place without her. The weight of her grief prevented her from attending, and guilt followed her every step in the days that followed. As the days turned into weeks, the story of Teresa and her family began to attract the attention of the local press. Reports about the woman who had lost her husband while expecting 7 children began to circulate, bringing donations and support from the entire community. Although the kindness of strangers was comforting, the shadow of Daniel's loss never left her heart. The letters of support and donations were a balm, but they could not replace his presence. "Teresa, you need to be strong. Daniel would have wanted that," a friend said during a visit, holding her hand firmly. "He always believed in you." "But how can I be strong without him?" Teresa replied, her voice choked. "He was my support, my everything." The truth was that Daniel's absence left a massive void, and each day became a struggle to fill that space with love and hope. Weeks turned into months, and life continued its course. But the pain of loss and the responsibility of raising 7 children remained heavy on Teresa's shoulders. Life was a mix of joy and sadness, and she wondered if she could find a new path, a new purpose, while trying to keep Daniel's memory alive in their hearts. The strength she sought was not just for herself, but for the children who, unknowingly, were also beginning to understand what life was like without their father. The cries of infants echoed through the hospital, a sound that blended joy and despair. After weeks in intensive care, the 7 babies had finally come into the world, but the euphoria of their arrival was overshadowed by the seriousness of the complications they faced. Teresa, exhausted and with a heavy heart, sat in an uncomfortable plastic chair, watching the monitors beep and the nurses rush back and forth. The smell of disinfectant was overpowering, and the cold light of the hospital made her feel even more alone. "You're going to be okay, my loves," Teresa murmured, looking at the nursery where her children were being cared for. She forced herself to believe her words, even though uncertainty consumed her. From the moment she found out she was pregnant with 7 children, each day felt like a greater challenge than the last. Visits were rare. Only her sisters came, bringing flowers and comforting words. Yet the feeling of isolation enveloped her. "You're so strong, Tay," said Lucia, one of her sisters, holding Teresa's hand. "You can count on us. You're not alone." "I know, but what if they don't make it?" Teresa whispered, tears streaming down her face. "I can't lose anyone else." Days turned into weeks, and Teresa's struggle to maintain hope became a draining routine. Her sister's support was a balm, but the weight of responsibility on her shoulders was overwhelming. Every time a doctor entered the room, her heart raced. The word stable had become her mantra, even though the reality was far more complex. Over time, the babies began to respond to treatment, but the sleepless nights and constant anxiety deeply affected Teresa. One day, while watching the monitors, she overheard a conversation between 2 nurses. "They are doing well, but it's still too early to celebrate," when looking at the little ones. "The mother needs to take care of herself too. The emotional pressure is very high." Teresa felt a knot in her throat. She had always been the strong one in the family, the matriarch who took care of everyone. But now, she felt vulnerable and lost. "You're not alone, Te." Lucia's voice echoed in her mind. "We need to stick together." As time passed, the babies were moved out of the neonatal ICU and into a special room where Teresa could stay with them. The first night there was magical and terrifying at the same time. Every cry was a reminder that now she was solely responsible. She made a promise to herself. She would not let the difficulties separate her from her children. Years went by, and the children began to grow. Teresa worked hard to give each of them the attention they needed, but life had its own demands. The house, which once was filled with laughter and play, had become a stage for arguments and rivalries. What started as a united home turned into a battlefield. The siblings, who used to support each other, were now drifting apart, each seeking their own identity. "You don't understand anything about what I want," Miguel, the oldest son, shouted during a heated argument with Clara, the only girl in the family. "You only think about yourself. And you only care about your own plans. You have no idea what I've been through." Clara replied, her eyes brimming with tears. Teresa, who was listening in secret, felt a sharp pain in her chest. It was as if the unity she had fought so hard to create was crumbling before her eyes. Stepping into the room, Teresa tried to intervene. "Miguel, Clara, please. We're a family. We need to support each other, especially now." But her words seemed to have no effect. The children glanced at each other, and the tension in the room was palpable. Each of them was so caught up in their own worlds that they hardly noticed how much they were hurting their mother. "I can't do this alone," Teresa thought, feeling powerless. "I lost your father, and now I'm losing you." As time passed, the arguments became more frequent and the disputes more intense. Teresa wondered if she would ever be able to restore the harmony that once existed in the family. She knew she needed to do something to turn the situation around, but doubt paralyzed her. The conversations they'd had when the children were small seemed so distant now. The struggle for unity and love was turning into a battle she didn't know how to win. Teresa looked out the window of their small house, watching the leaves of the trees dance in the wind. The morning sun illuminated the tired yet determined face of the woman who, for over 2 decades, had fought against adversity. After Daniel's death, her world had changed drastically, and now, with her children growing and seeking their own paths, she felt a void that never seemed to fill. It was time to act. With a deep sigh, Teresa stood up and prepared for work. The day began early at the factory, and she knew that to support the household and provide for her children, she needed to be there. Upon arriving at the factory, the routine quickly enveloped her. The sound of machines and the smell of metal and oil surrounded her. It was a tough environment, but Teresa found strength in thoughts of her children. "I do everything for them," she murmured to herself. By the end of her shift, her hands were dirty and tired, but the feeling of duty fulfilled filled her. However, upon returning home, the reality of her relationships with her children awaited. She knew that despite her efforts, family unity was unraveling. Dinners, which used to be moments of laughter and story exchanges, had become rare events. The house felt quieter, and Teresa missed the relaxed conversations that once filled its walls. That night, she decided it was time to bring the family together again. A family dinner, she thought, as she prepared roasted chicken, one of everyone's favorite dishes. She envisioned a table full of people, all talking and laughing. "I can't let us drift apart," she reflected while chopping vegetables. "We need to reconnect." However, over the following days, Teresa's anticipation turned into disappointment. On the day of the dinner, only 2 of her 7 children showed up, Clara and Miguel. The others had commitments, or so they claimed. Teresa's heart ached as she looked at the carefully set table, now occupied by just 3. "Sorry the others couldn't make it," Clara said with a sad look. "Everyone has their own lives, Mom." The evening passed with steaming plates and polite conversation, but the absence of the others weighed heavily in the air. "I feel like we're drifting apart," Teresa commented, breaking the silence at one point. "I wish everyone were here. We need to come together again." Miguel looked at his mother, his eyes reflecting concern. "Mom, everyone has their responsibilities. Life isn't easy for any of us. But you know we love you, right?" "I know, my son, but love isn't enough if we don't communicate. We have to talk more, listen to each other." She replied, her voice filled with emotion. "When was the last time we were all together? When did we last really talk to each other?" Clara, who had been observing the conversation, finally spoke up. "Mom, you're right, but we can't force things. Each of us is dealing with our own battles. Sometimes it's hard to find time for family." Teresa's gaze softened. "I understand, but I want you to know that I will always be here, ready to listen and support you. Life is short, and I don't want distance to separate us." That night, after her children left the house, Teresa sat at the table, now empty. The smell of roasted chicken still lingered in the air, but the table felt cold and lonely. "What can I do to bring them back?" she questioned herself, feeling a mix of sadness and determination. "I can't give up on them." As the night wore on, Teresa decided to write letters to each of her children. She wanted them to know how much family meant to her, how unconditional her love was. "I will do whatever it takes for us to understand each other again," she promised, as the pen danced across the paper. Deep down, Teresa knew the road wouldn't be easy, but the hope of reconnecting drove her forward. She was willing to fight for her family, as she always had, believing that despite their differences and distances, love could still prevail. The sun shone brightly that day, but the atmosphere in the hospital was one of apprehension. Teresa's children, who had long grown distant from one another, were summoned to gather. The news of their mother's stroke spread like wildfire, and now each of them faced a storm of emotions as they hurried to the hospital. The waiting room was a space of uncertainty, with each sibling lost in their own thoughts. Lucas, the eldest, gazed out the window, watching the clouds move swiftly across the blue sky. He remembered the days when his mother taught him to ride a bike, holding onto the seat as he pedaled. Now, the thought of losing Teresa seemed unbearable. Beside him, Anna, the only daughter, held her trembling hands. "What are we going to do if she doesn't recover?" she asked, her voice cracking. Lucas turned to her, trying to convey a sense of security he didn't feel. "She's going to be fine, Anna. She's always been strong." In another corner of the room, Rafael and Tiago exchanged nervous glances, recalling the arguments they'd had in recent years, always too caught up in their own lives to be there for their mother. "We should have been more present," Tiago murmured, the weight of regret heavy in his voice. Rafael nodded, but struggled to find words that could mend the past. "Let's do that now. Let's be there for her, no matter what happens." Finally, the door to the room opened, and a nurse stepped out. "Mrs. Teresa is stable but still under observation. You can see her for a few minutes." Her words were a momentary relief, but anxiety still hung in the air as they made their way to the room. Upon entering, the scene was poignant. Teresa lay in bed, her face pale, but there was still a light in her eyes that made everyone feel a little more hopeful. "Hi, Mom," Lucas said, his voice thick with emotion. Teresa smiled weakly, but her eyes sparkled at the sight of her children together. "You're all here. That's all I needed," she replied, her voice soft yet full of emotion. The siblings looked at each other, realizing that despite their differences, they were finally together, just as they should have been all along. "Anna, dear, are you okay?" Teresa asked, noticing her daughter's worried expression. "I'm just scared," Anna admitted, wiping away a tear that had slipped down her cheek. "I didn't know this could happen so fast." Teresa reached out her hand, and Anna grasped it tightly. "Life is full of surprises, my daughter, but you need to remember what matters: family." "I'm sorry we weren't here sooner, Mom," Tiago said, guilt evident in his voice. "We let things drift apart." Rafael, standing beside him, added, "But that's going to change. We'll be here for you together." Teresa's gaze softened, and she realized that even in the face of adversity, her children were beginning to understand the importance of the unity she had always tried to teach. "I wish to see you all more united," Teresa spoke with effort, the weakness evident in her voice. "Life isn't easy, and I won't always be here. But if you support each other, everything will be easier. Your love is what I desire most." The siblings exchanged glances, and a new understanding began to blossom among them. "Mom, we promise we'll truly come together," Lucas said, a determined look on his face. "We'll do it for you and for Dad." The words seemed to resonate in the room, bringing a renewed sense of hope. Teresa smiled faintly, satisfied to see her children finally reconnecting. That's all I've ever wanted, for you to take care of each other. Love is the only thing that truly matters." As the conversation continued, a new bond formed between them. A silent commitment that, regardless of difficulties, they would face everything together as a family. From that moment on, Teresa knew that even in her fragility, a growing strength was rising among her children, a hope that could weather any storm life might throw at them. As the siblings gathered with Teresa in the hospital, the atmosphere was filled with anticipation and nervousness. The light in the room was soft, illuminating their mother's tired face, which she struggled to keep calm in such a delicate situation. Lucas, the eldest son who had always been a bit more reserved, entered the room with a serious expression. He approached his mother's bed and took her hand, feeling her fragility. "Mom," Lucas began, his voice trembling. I heard some news today. The man who killed Dad is being tried." The air stopped for a moment. The other siblings who had been speaking softly immediately fell silent and turned to Lucas. The revelation hung in the air like a heavy cloud. Teresa looked at Lucas, her heart racing. Memories of that fateful day flooded back and she felt a knot in her throat. "Are you serious? Is he finally going to pay for what he did?" asked Anna, the youngest sister, her eyes wide with disbelief. "Yes," Lucas replied, determination growing in his voice. "The trial starts next week. I think we should go. We need to do this together. For Dad." The siblings exchanged glances, a mix of incredulity and resolve washing over them. The idea of confronting their father's murderer was daunting, but there was something powerful in the unity forming between them. They had faced so many challenges, and now, with this new opportunity for justice, they felt they couldn't let fear hold them back. "I agree," Raphael said firmly. "We need to be strong, not just for ourselves, but for Dad's memory. He always wanted us to stick together." The other siblings nodded, a sense of solidarity growing among them. The pain of losing Daniel was still deep, but now there was a possibility of justice that motivated them to act. Teresa watched the conversation with a mix of pride and sadness. She wanted her children to feel safe, but she also knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. "Are you sure?" Teresa asked, trying to keep the worry out of her voice. "This could be very painful." "We have to do this, Mom," Lucas said, squeezing her hand. "We're stronger together, and we need to show him that we're not afraid." Amid whispers and promises, the siblings came together with a plan. The following week, they prepared for the trial, each dealing with their own emotions. The day of the court session arrived, and the atmosphere was tense. They sat together, all dressed similarly, a symbol of their unity. The courtroom was imposing, and the smell of formality filled the air. Teresa's heart was heavy, but at the same time, a sense of hope was growing inside her. When Daniel's killer was brought into the room, a wave of revulsion swept over everyone. He seemed indifferent, almost disdainful. But the siblings, far from feeling intimidated, found strength in one another. When it was their turn to testify, each of them stood up one by one and shared their memories of Daniel. They spoke about the loving father, the man who did everything to care for his family, who taught them to value life and unity. Their courage resonated in the room, and for a moment, the silence was profound. The judge, impressed by the children's heartfelt testimony, looked at the defendant with a stern expression. When the sentence was finally pronounced, and the man was sentenced to a long prison term, Teresa felt a wave of relief wash over her. Tears streamed down her face, but this time they were tears of gratitude. "We did it, Mom," Lucas said, a shy smile spreading across his face. "We did this together." That moment of justice not only provided closure for the pain they had carried, but also strengthened the bonds that had been threatened for so long. Teresa looked at her children, each reflecting the determination and love she had always hoped they would possess. The experience brought them even closer, and they promised to honor the legacy of love and unity that Daniel always wanted for the family. With the trial behind them, the family decided it was time to start anew. Together, they found a new home, a space where they could create new memories and strengthen the ties that bound them. The atmosphere was filled with hope, and Teresa knew that despite the challenges, love would always prevail.